The date recorded in the unit's morning log was February 14, 1981. The timestamp beside it read 0520 hours, written in block letters by the duty officer before the first shift change. Outside the facility, the Baltic Sea lay flat and steel gray beneath a low winter sky. Air temperature hovered just above freezing, while surface water readings taken from the pier showed barely 4 degrees Celsius. Visibility was limited, as it usually was at that time of year, with a thin mist hanging over the harbor and reducing the horizon to a dull blur of lights and silhouettes. The NATO maritime facility sat along a narrow stretch of coast shared by multiple Allied navies, its docks crowded with patrol craft, support vessels, and training platforms. The region carried strategic weight far beyond its modest geography. Sea lanes, listening posts, and undersea cables intersected here, making even routine activity subject to layered security protocols. Nothing in the early hours suggested urgency or threat. It was simply another cold morning at a base designed to treat every morning as potentially consequential. By 0545 hours, the Navy SEAL detachment assigned to rotational maritime security had begun its standard pre-dawn routine. Physical conditioning was conducted indoors to avoid exposure injuries, followed by equipment checks in the dive locker adjacent to the pier. Regulators were inspected, hoses flex-tested, and pressure gauges cross-verified against secondary instruments. Cold water dive suits were laid out in precise order, each labeled with serial numbers that matched individual logbooks. The day's operational schedule was pinned to the corkboard near the communications room, outlining harbor patrol windows, underwater inspection assignments, and training evolutions coordinated with host nation forces. 2 divers were scheduled for hull sweeps of visiting NATO vessels, while another pair prepared for a subsurface infrastructure inspection focusing on pier pilings and cable junction points. Every task followed a checklist, and every checklist required sign-off. Redundancy was not treated as inefficiency but as insurance against oversight. This emphasis on repetition and documentation defined the unit's internal culture. Procedures were followed the same way regardless of weather, fatigue, or perceived threat level. Chain of command relationships were clear and unambiguous, from the enlisted divers responsible for inspections to the officers reviewing reports at the end of each shift. Information flowed upward in a controlled manner, stripped of speculation and framed strictly around observable facts. If a diver noted an irregularity, it was logged without interpretation. If equipment behaved unexpectedly, maintenance records were consulted before conclusions were drawn. The prevailing mindset discouraged assumptions and rewarded consistency. The absence of incident was not treated as proof of safety, but as a temporary condition that still required verification. The dive element assigned to subsurface security had spent weeks familiarizing itself with the harbor's underwater environment. They knew the layout of the seabed, the placement of mooring blocks, the texture of sediment near the breakwater, and the way silt tended to settle after storms or heavy vessel movement. Their task was not to engage intruders, but to ensure the integrity of the underwater domain through inspection and presence. This meant slow, methodical movement along predetermined routes, guided by compass headings and distance markers placed during earlier surveys. Over time, the divers developed an intuitive sense of what belonged and what did not. Small changes stood out not because they were dramatic, but because they disrupted a pattern that had been carefully memorized. At approximately 0710 hours, during a routine inspection along the outer edge of the primary pier, one diver noted a subtle disturbance in the silt layer near a set of seabed markers. The markers themselves were intact, but the sediment around them appeared uneven, as if recently displaced. The water was already murky, but this disturbance differed from the diffuse clouds caused by tidal shifts or passing vessels. Moments later, a faint vibration was felt through the diver's equipment, too weak to register as mechanical interference but noticeable enough to prompt a pause. A quick check of nearby structures revealed no visible damage, and no authorized underwater activity had been scheduled for that time. The diver completed the assigned route without further incident and surfaced as planned. Upon debrief, the observation was recorded in the dive log as an environmental irregularity. The entry included time, location coordinates, depth, and water conditions, along with a brief note about sediment displacement and transient vibration. No immediate correlation could be made with known factors such as ship movement or maintenance work. The supervising officer reviewed the log, initialed it, and filed it with the day's reports. The anomaly was not escalated, as it did not meet criteria for a security alert. Harbor activity continued uninterrupted, and subsequent dives later that morning revealed nothing further out of the ordinary. By mid-morning, the base had settled into its normal rhythm. Training evolutions resumed, communications traffic remained routine, and Allied vessels prepared for scheduled departures. The earlier observation remained confined to a single line in a logbook, one of dozens generated that day. No alarms were raised, and no changes were made to operational posture. The SEAL detachment moved on to the next set of tasks, treating the anomaly as a data point rather than a signal. In an environment defined by discipline and procedure, such moments were neither ignored nor dramatized. They were simply recorded, preserved for future reference should they ever prove relevant. 4 days after the initial observation on February 18, 1981, a similar entry appeared in the dive logs. The timestamp was again early morning, this time 0658 hours, recorded during a scheduled hull inspection of a NATO support vessel berthed along the inner pier. Water conditions were nearly identical to those noted earlier in the week. Low visibility, near freezing temperature, minimal surface disturbance. During the latter portion of the inspection route, another diver reported uneven sediment patterns along a section of seabed previously documented as stable. The disturbance was subtle, localized, and not accompanied by any visible foreign object. As before, the diver completed the assignment without deviation and surfaced on schedule. The observation was logged independently, using similar language but without reference to the earlier report. At the time of entry, neither diver was aware of the other's notes. The similarity only became apparent later, when logs were reviewed side by side. Over the following 10 days, comparable irregularities were recorded on 3 additional occasions. Each entry occurred within a narrow time window, generally between 0630 and 0730 hours, and always during routine inspections rather than heightened security evolutions. The divers involved rotated through assignments according to standard scheduling, meaning no single individual was present for all observations. Despite this, the language used in the logs began to show consistency. Phrases such as localized sediment displacement and unexplained seabed alteration appeared more than once, each accompanied by precise coordinates and depth readings. None of the incidents triggered alarms or required deviation from planned routes, yet their recurrence drew quiet attention during weekly log reviews conducted by the team's supervising officer. As the pattern emerged, efforts were made to eliminate environmental explanations. Tidal charts were consulted and compared against the times of the observations. The Baltic's modest tidal range offered little variability, and no correlation was found between tidal peaks and the recorded anomalies. Weather logs maintained by the base meteorological office were reviewed next. Wind speeds, barometric pressure, and recent storm activity were examined, but no significant weather events aligned with the disturbances. Marine life was also considered, particularly the movement of fish schools or bottom-feeding species known to agitate sediment. However, the localized nature of the disturbances, combined with their recurrence near specific infrastructure points, made this explanation increasingly unlikely. Harbor activity schedules were then cross-checked. Vessel movement logs detailed arrivals, departures, and maneuvering times for all ships entering or leaving the facility. While the harbor was active, the anomalies did not coincide with periods of heavy traffic or tug operations that might reasonably disturb the seabed. Maintenance records showed no authorized underwater work during the relevant windows. Civilian contractors and Allied units operating in the area were accounted for, and their activities did not overlap with the reported times. Each elimination narrowed the range of plausible explanations without providing an alternative. During this same period, communications technicians supporting harbor security noted minor irregularities in passive sonar readings. These were not alarms, nor did they indicate a clear contact. Instead, they appeared as fleeting distortions during specific hours, often dismissed as background noise or equipment sensitivity in cold water. When these notes were compared informally with dive logs, a rough alignment in timing became apparent. The sonar equipment underwent standard diagnostic tests and calibration checks, all of which confirmed normal function. No faults were detected, and no changes were made to operating parameters. The interference remained intermittent and subtle, insufficient on its own to warrant escalation. Attention then shifted to rotation schedules and watch patterns. Analysts within the unit began to notice that the anomalies tended to occur during periods of reduced activity, typically just before or after shift changes. These windows were characterized by fewer personnel on the pier and minimal vessel movement. Additionally, several of the incidents aligned with the arrival or departure of NATO vessels, though not necessarily during the maneuvering itself. The timing suggested a deliberate avoidance of peak activity rather than random coincidence. Still, without direct evidence, the observations remained categorized as unexplained rather than suspicious. Physical indicators also began to accumulate. During a scheduled infrastructure inspection in late February, divers noted slight scarring on an anchor chain resting area that did not match known wear patterns. The markings were shallow and easily overlooked, yet they were absent from previous survey photographs. In another instance, a seabed marker was found displaced by a small margin, still within acceptable tolerance but no longer aligned precisely with its recorded position. The marker was reset, and the adjustment logged. Nearby cables showed minor disturbance in surrounding sediment, though the cables themselves were intact. Each finding taken alone was inconclusive. Together, they suggested repeated contact with the same underwater spaces. Within the team, awareness grew quietly. No one used the language of threat or intrusion. Instead, divers and supervisors began to reference earlier logs during post-dive reviews, noting similarities without assigning cause. The consensus that formed was procedural rather than emotional. The environment was behaving in ways that could not be fully explained by known variables. This recognition did not lead to changes in behavior or posture. The unit continued its routines exactly as prescribed, documenting each observation with increased precision. The absence of overt reaction was deliberate, reflecting a belief that consistency would yield clearer data over time. By early March, the supervising officer compiled a detailed memorandum summarizing the observations. The document included copies of dive logs, sonar notes, harbor activity schedules, and environmental data, all aligned chronologically. The language remained measured and non-speculative, referring to the incidents collectively as unidentified subsurface activity of unknown origin. The memo emphasized repetition, timing, and location rather than interpretation. It was submitted through the established chain of command for review, accompanied by a recommendation for continued monitoring. No immediate action was requested, and none was taken. The routine continued, even as the records quietly suggested that something beneath the harbor was operating according to a pattern of its own. The memorandum submitted in early March moved steadily through the naval chain of command, passing from the local facilities operations office to regional maritime leadership without urgency or annotation beyond standard routing marks. Senior officers reviewing the document did so alongside daily operational summaries, treating it as one dataset among many. What distinguished it was not alarmist language but density. The alignment of timestamps, locations, and repeated observations drew attention precisely because the reporting avoided speculation. After a preliminary review, command staff requested clarification dives to be conducted along the same routes identified in the logs. These were framed as routine verification inspections rather than investigations. At the same time, minor adjustments were made to the harbor's security posture. Watch rotations were tightened by minutes rather than hours, and documentation requirements for subsurface activity were expanded. No formal alert was issued, and outward operations continued without visible change. As additional data was gathered, naval leadership opted to involve counterintelligence specialists. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service was notified through established channels, with the request narrowly scoped to pattern analysis rather than threat response. NCIS analysts received copies of the logs and supporting material and began comparing them against reports from other installations in the region. This comparison was conducted quietly, without site-wide briefings or notifications to allied partners. Within days, Analysts identified similar, though previously unconnected, reports from separate NATO-adjacent facilities. These reports described minor underwater irregularities that had been logged and dismissed independently over the preceding months. None had triggered escalation on their own. Viewed collectively, however, they suggested a broader pattern of activity distributed across multiple locations. The emerging picture prompted consultation beyond naval counterintelligence. Maritime analysts from the intelligence community were briefed under restricted conditions, focusing on underwater access points and historical patterns of interest in the Baltic region. The discussion avoided naming adversaries directly, instead framing the issue as a potential exploitation of cold water maritime environments for intelligence collection. Analysts reviewed known capabilities associated with underwater reconnaissance, including the use of trained divers to survey infrastructure, cables, and harbor defenses. No conclusions were drawn, but risk assessments were updated to reflect the possibility that the anomalies represented deliberate human activity rather than environmental variance. This reframing marked a subtle but important shift. The irregularities were no longer treated solely as unexplained phenomena, but as potential indicators of intelligence gathering. Emphasis moved toward the vulnerability of underwater approaches that lay beyond the immediate visibility of surface patrols. Infrastructure maps were revisited with fresh attention to access points that could be reached covertly, particularly during periods of low activity. The threat model evolved incrementally, replacing assumptions of natural causes with scenarios involving deliberate, repeated intrusion. Even so, the language used in official correspondence remained cautious, avoiding definitive statements in favor of conditional assessments. Despite the involvement of intelligence agencies, directives to the SEAL detachment remained conservative. The team was instructed to maintain its established routines without alteration. No authorization was given for confrontation, interception, or deviation from inspection protocols. The rationale was twofold. First, consistency in behavior would prevent alerting any potential observer to heightened scrutiny. Second, uninterrupted routine offered the best chance of gathering untainted data over time. Observation was prioritized over interdiction, with the understanding that premature action could compromise a larger intelligence picture. Analytical efforts intensified behind the scenes. Detailed seabed maps were overlaid with infrastructure diagrams, marking points where repeated disturbances had been logged. Cable routes, mooring zones, and hull inspection paths were examined together, revealing clusters of interest rather than random distribution. Analysts correlated dive logs with sonar notes and harbor schedules, narrowing the temporal window in which the anomalies occurred. This correlation sharpened suspicion without confirming intent. Each new piece of data reinforced the impression of deliberate timing and selective access, yet stopped short of proving intrusion. As confidence in the pattern grew, coordination between naval leadership and federal intelligence agencies deepened. Planning discussions focused on verification rather than apprehension. The objective was to confirm the presence and nature of any foreign activity before considering response options. This approach reflected the broader logic of Cold War counterintelligence, where certainty was valued over speed and silence often outweighed confrontation. The SEAL team continued its inspections, unaware of the full scope of analysis unfolding beyond the base. To them, the work remained unchanged. Cold water, limited visibility, and meticulous logging. Above them, the machinery of intelligence had begun to turn, quietly and deliberately, guided by the conviction that something beneath the Baltic was operating with purpose. The surveillance phase was initiated without any visible change to daily operations. Passive sonar arrays already in use for harbor monitoring were recalibrated to prioritize low-speed, low-noise contacts rather than conventional vessel movement. This adjustment was subtle, executed through software parameters rather than hardware changes, ensuring that routine acoustic signatures remained unaffected. Timed dive monitoring was introduced as an internal analytical layer, aligning diver schedules with sonar data and environmental readings. Equipment was positioned to increase coverage of previously identified points of interest, but routes and inspection protocols were left unchanged. From the perspective of personnel on the pier and in the water, the routine remained identical. Only the flow of data behind the scenes reflected the shift from general security to focused observation. Within days, the accumulated data produced a clearer picture. During a narrow window shortly after dawn, passive sonar registered a distinct acoustic signature moving slowly along the seabed. The profile did not match that of marine life or drifting debris, nor did it resemble the noise patterns associated with authorized underwater work. The movement was deliberate, maintaining a consistent depth and speed, and altering course in response to underwater structures rather than surface activity. Analysts noted the shape and rhythm of the signature as consistent with a single diver operating with controlled propulsion. The timing coincided precisely with earlier anomalies recorded in dive logs. Entry and exit points were identified near sections of the harbor where sediment disturbance had been previously documented. The confirmation of a diver-shaped contact did not prompt immediate action. No pursuit was authorized, and no attempt was made to intercept the individual underwater. Instead, the contact was tracked passively as it navigated along infrastructure lines and then retreated toward deeper water beyond the harbor's perimeter. The diver was allowed to surface outside the immediate security zone, where detection would be more difficult and intervention more conspicuous. This restraint reflected a calculated decision to preserve the integrity of the intelligence operation. By avoiding engagement, analysts could observe patterns of behavior without revealing awareness or intent. Attention shifted to identifying how the diver accessed the area. Surveillance expanded to include surface and onshore activity near the suspected exit point. Over several days, analysts observed a foreign national whose movements aligned with the timing of the underwater activity. The individual maintained a civilian profile, frequenting port-adjacent areas under the guise of legitimate business. Access patterns were examined through travel records, lodging information, and port entry logs. Nothing in isolation appeared irregular. Combined, however, the data suggested a deliberate alignment between the individual's presence and the periods of underwater intrusion. Surveillance followed the individual quietly, extending beyond the immediate vicinity of the base. Movements were tracked across transportation nodes and commercial districts without interference. The objective remained confirmation rather than confrontation. Analysts documented routines, noting how the individual avoided predictable schedules and maintained limited contact with others. No direct communication with known intelligence operatives was observed, reinforcing the assessment that the individual operated with a high degree of compartmentalization. The absence of overt coordination complicated efforts to map a broader network. The decision to arrest was made only after sufficient evidence had been compiled to establish unauthorized activity linked to foreign intelligence. The arrest took place away from the naval facility, in a location chosen to minimize attention and avoid diplomatic complications. It was conducted by federal authorities rather than military personnel, and it proceeded without resistance. No public announcement followed, and no disruption to base operations was visible. The individual was removed quietly from circulation, leaving no immediate trace of the investigation's conclusion. During subsequent debriefings, the individual admitted affiliation with Soviet intelligence services. The mission, as summarized in classified reports, involved underwater reconnaissance and infrastructure mapping focused on NATO maritime facilities. The diver had operated independently, using civilian cover and improvised access methods to avoid detection. Equipment was minimal and designed for concealment rather than endurance. The information gathered was intended to support broader intelligence assessments rather than immediate action. The confession provided clarity on intent but little insight into command structure. Critical gaps remained. The handler responsible for tasking the diver was never directly identified, and communication methods were described only in fragments. No direct links to a larger network were established, and no additional operatives were uncovered. The scope of the operation remained uncertain, raising the possibility that it represented only one element of a broader, distributed effort. With the diver detained and activity ceased, the harbor returned to its familiar stillness. Yet the absence of resolution underscored a defining feature of Cold War counterintelligence: confirmation without closure, and the knowledge that silence often marked not an end, but a pause. In the weeks following the arrest, planning shifted toward a final objective that remained deliberately limited in scope. Intelligence officers proposed a controlled attempt to draw out whoever, had directed the underwater reconnaissance. Rather than fabricating new activity, routines were adjusted just enough to suggest continuity. Minor, reversible changes were introduced into harbor procedures, creating patterns that could be detected by an external observer without alerting base personnel. Certain inspections were logged at predictable intervals, and equipment placement was made marginally more visible from underwater approaches previously identified as access points. These signals were designed to appear incidental, consistent with normal operational drift rather than intentional bait. The intent was not provocation, but confirmation. If a handler existed nearby or maintained contact through indirect means, analysts expected some form of reaction, however subtle. For a brief period, indicators suggested that the signals had been noticed. Passive monitoring detected minor deviations in background activity near the harbor perimeter, though nothing that met established thresholds for intrusion. Sonar readings showed brief anomalies that resembled hesitation rather than approach, as if an observer were reassessing risk. Onshore surveillance noted changes in civilian traffic patterns consistent with heightened caution. Then, abruptly, the indicators ceased. No further underwater signatures appeared, and no new irregularities were logged. The suspected exit points remained undisturbed. The anticipated response never materialized, and no additional contacts were identified. Analysts concluded that awareness had likely been achieved on the opposing side, prompting an immediate disengagement. The withdrawal was comprehensive and efficient. Over subsequent weeks, the anomalies that had driven the investigation failed to reappear. Dive inspections returned consistent results, sonar logs stabilized, and seabed markers remained undisturbed. No new scarring or sediment displacement was observed, even during periods that had previously shown correlation. The absence of activity suggested a deliberate termination rather than a pause. Intelligence assessments favored the interpretation that the network supporting the diver had been dismantled or reassigned, its objectives either completed or rendered untenable. There was no indication of panic or haste, only a clean disengagement characteristic of disciplined intelligence operations. With no further developments, the case moved toward formal closure. Documentation related to the investigation was consolidated and reclassified under higher security designations. Access to files was restricted to a narrow group of officials, and references to the incident were removed from routine operational summaries. Official records were sanitized to reflect only generic security reviews and procedural updates. The rationale was consistent with Cold War practice. Minimize the visibility of intelligence successes to avoid revealing methods or priorities. What remained in open records was indistinguishable from routine administrative maintenance, leaving no trace of the activity that had briefly unfolded beneath the harbor. For the SEAL detachment, the transition back to routine was gradual but unmistakable. Dive schedules normalized, and inspection routes reverted to standard patterns. Logs once again filled with repetitive entries describing stable conditions and uneventful operations. No formal briefing acknowledged the broader investigation, and no questions were invited. An internal commendation was issued quietly, citing diligence and adherence to procedure without elaboration. To the divers, the episode became a matter of record rather than memory, preserved in classified files they would never see. The water remained cold, the visibility limited, and the routines unchanged. Yet the experience left a subtle imprint. Awareness had been sharpened, not through confrontation but through recognition. The team understood that the absence of disturbance did not equate to the absence of interest. The harbor's stillness now carried an additional layer of meaning, shaped by the knowledge that unseen activity could occur without ever announcing itself. Procedures were followed with the same discipline as before, but with an implicit understanding that patterns mattered, even when they resolved into nothing. In this environment, vigilance was measured not by reaction but by restraint. No victory was declared, and none was required. The outcome aligned with the realities of Cold War intelligence, where confirmation rarely produced closure and success often manifested as silence. The opposing side had withdrawn without acknowledgement, leaving questions unanswered and networks unexposed. The sea returned to its familiar calm, its surface betraying no sign of what had transpired below. For those tasked with watching it, the lesson endured. Beneath routine and repetition, the contest continued, unresolved and unspoken, shaping a world where even still water could no longer be assumed innocent.